Hello and welcome to another section of this complete Angular course. In this section, we are going to learn about template-driven forms in Angular in great detail. Here, our main focus will be to learn how to use an HTML form in Angular using template-driven approach. And let's start this section by having a high-level overview of what is a template-driven form and how to make a form template-driven using Angular. Now, you might ask, why do we need to use a template-driven form in Angular? Why can't we simply use a normal HTML form? Well, that's because using Angular we create a single page application. But a normal HTML form, when it gets submitted, it sends a new request to the server and it reloads the page. And since Angular application is a single page application, we can say that it restarts the complete Angular application. And to avoid this, we need Angular's help to stop this default behavior of reloading the page whenever the form is submitted. And that can be achieved using a template-driven form or by using a reactive form. So when we use a template-driven form or a reactive form, working with form becomes much more easier. We can easily read form control values, validation of form data is easier, and there are other advantages as well. That's why instead of using a normal HTML form, we use either template-driven form or reactive form in Angular. In this section, we are mainly going to focus on template-driven approach of working with forms in Angular, and in the next section, we will learn about reactive forms. We basically use a form to collect data from the user. And in Angular, there are two ways in which you can create a form: by using template-driven form approach or by using reactive form approach. As I mentioned earlier, you will learn about reactive form in detail in the next section of this course. In this section, let's focus on learning about template-driven form. In a template-driven form, we do most of the things like behavior or validation of the form in the template itself using directives or attributes on the form. Everything happens in the template and hence very little code is required in the component class. That's why it is called as template driven form, because everything we are going to do in the template itself, and we are going to write very less code for a template driven form. Now, the advantage of using a template driven form is that a template driven form is a simple HTML form on which we use some Angular's built-in directives or attributes to work with it. It involves very little code in the component class, and most of the things are done in the template itself. And because of that, template driven form is easy to start with and it is easy to understand. But there are also disadvantages with template driven form. For example, using template driven form, it is difficult to add a control dynamically at runtime. And also with template driven form, unit testing is a bit challenging. So now let's learn how we can create a template driven form in Angular. Now keep in mind that in order to work with forms in Angular, we need to import forms module from the Angular/forms library. So this is the first thing which we need to do in the app module. Let's go to VS Code. And here I have created a brand new Angular project. I'm calling it template driven form. And in this project, I only have this app component. And inside this app component, I'm writing some HTML in order to display a form in the web page. And in the app component.css file, I have also written some CSS in order to design that form. So if I go to the web page, the form will look something like this. Okay, so here in the app component.html, I have written a very simple HTML. Here, right now, we are not using anything related to Angular. This HTML which you see here, it is a pure HTML. It does not have anything related to Angular. So as I mentioned, in order to work with forms in Angular, the first thing which we need to do is we need to import forms module from Angular/form. For that, let's go to this app module file, and there in the imports array, here we need to import forms module, and we need to import this forms module from Angular/form. So when I select this, you will notice that the forms module has been imported, and an import statement for this forms module from Angular/forms has also been added here. So this is the first thing which we need to do. That's because this forms module is a library which provides us with some methods and also some directives which we can use on a form in order to work with it. And you will see that throughout this section. So this is the first step. Let me save this file and let's close this app module.ts file. Now let's open app component.html file. So here we have our form. Let me put a line break after this header. So here we have our form, and on this form we also have this action attribute and this method attribute. But since we are creating a single page application here, when this form will be submitted, we don't want to make a new request to the server directly. Okay, we don't want to make a new request to the server and reload the page. So I'm going to remove this action attribute and this method attribute from this form. I'll keep this CSS class here because we want to design this form. And the next thing which I'm going to do is, if I scroll down, we also have a submit button here. So if I scroll down, here we have an input of type button. But instead of making this input of type button, I'm going to make it of type submit. Okay, so what we want is, whenever this form will be submitted, it is going to emit an event. It is going to emit ng submit event. So we can listen to that event on this form. So on this form, I'm going to bind the ng submit event. And for event binding, we use a set of parentheses. Inside that, we specify the event name. So here the event name is going to be ng submit. And this event will be raised every time this form is submitted. In this case, every time this submit button is clicked. All right. And when this event will happen, let's say we want to execute some code. Here, let's say we want to execute a method. And I'm going to call this method on form submitted. You can name it anything. And let's go ahead and let's create this method inside the component class. So I'm writing this HTML for this form inside this app component.html file. And for this HTML file, the component class is present inside this app component.ts. Here we have this app component class. Inside this app component class, let's go ahead and let's create this method. And whenever this method is called, let's say we want to log something in the console. Here, let's say we want to log form submitted. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's save this HTML file as well. Let's go to the web page and let me open developer console. Let's go to console tab. Let me clear everything here. And when I click on the submit button, you see it has logged this message form submitted. So basically when this submit method was clicked, the ng submit event was emitted. And when the ng submit event was emitted, it is going to call this on form submit method. And what we are doing inside this method, we are simply logging this message form submitted. Now what I want is, instead of logging this form submitted text in the developer console, I want to log this form itself in the console. For that, on this form, I'm going to use a template reference variable. For that, we can use a pound sign and we can specify a name for this variable. Let's call it maybe registration form. You can name it anything. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass this registration form to this on form submit method. Now what this registration form it is going to store? It is going to store a reference of this form, right? So let's go to app component.ts file. There, now we are also passing an argument to this on form submitted. So here, let's call it maybe form. And what is the type of this form going to be? It is going to be HTML form element. Okay. Now let's go ahead and let's log this form in the console. So instead of logging this text message, we are going to log the form itself. If I save the changes, if we go to the web page now, let me clear everything here. And now when I click on this submit button, the form will be submitted. The ng submit event will happen. And when that will happen, it is going to log a reference of this form, because this registration form, this template reference variable, it is going to store a reference to this form. So that will be logged in the developer console. If I go back and if I click on this submit button, you will notice that that form, the HTML of that form has been logged here. Now here, instead of logging the HTML of that form, what I want is, I want to get this form as a JavaScript object so that we can manipulate it from our Angular application. Now, in order to do that, all we have to do is, to this template reference variable, we need to assign ng form. So here we can say ng form. And again, this ng form, it is provided by forms module. So this ng form, it is a directive, and this directive makes a form a template driven form. Now keep in mind that we don't need to explicitly specify this ng form in order to make this HTML form as a template driven form. When we imported forms module from Angular/forms, that time only Angular will find this form and it will convert it to a template driven form. Okay, and this ng form here, it is going to store a reference to that template driven form, and we are assigning that reference back to this registration form. And with this, if we save the changes and if we go to the web page, here we have an error, and the error here is because now here when we are specifying the type as HTML form element, this form is no more of type HTML form element. Now it is of type ng form. Okay, and in order to use this ng form, we also need to import it from Angular/forms. With this, if we save the changes and if we go to the web page, that error is gone. And now just notice what happens when I click on this submit button. You will notice that now an object of type ng form has been logged here. So now this form parameter, it is storing an instance of type ng form. Now if I expand this ng form object, there we have a lot of properties which we can make use of in order to work with this form. And we are going to start working with this form using this ng form object from our next lecture. Now, one more thing which I want to do here is, instead of passing this template reference variable as an argument to this on form submitted method, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to create a property here. I'll simply call it as form, and it is again going to be of type ng form. Okay, and on this form, I'm going to use @viewChild decorator, because as we have learned, using the @viewChild decorator, and in order to use this @viewChild decorator, we also need to import it from Angular/Co. So using viewChild decorator, we can access a DOM element or a component from the template. To this, let's pass a parameter, and here I'm going to pass this template reference variable as the parameter. Okay, and we no more need to pass this registration form template reference variable to this on form submitted method. So I'll remove it, and here also we will remove this parameter from this on form submitted method. And here we are going to log this form property of this app component. So here we can simply say this dot form. Now here we have this error because Angular wants us to assign something to this form property. We have not initialized it. That's why we have this error, as you can see. So for now, what I will do is I'll go to tsconfig.json, and there I'll set this strict to false, and I'll save this file. With that, this error should also be gone. And if I go to the web page, we should still see this ng form object logged when we click on this submit button, as you can see. Okay, so from the next lecture, let's see how we can work with this form using this ng form object. In the last lecture, we created a template driven form. And to create a template driven form, what we did is, first we imported forms module from this Angular/forms library. And when we do that, and whenever Angular finds a form in the Angular application, for example, like here, it will make that form a template driven form. Okay, so the first thing which we need to do in order to create a template driven form is we need to import this forms module from Angular/forms library. Then on this form, we added a template reference variable, and to that we are assigning this ng form directive. Now this ng form directive, it is going to store a reference to the template driven form. In this case, this ng form, it is going to store a reference to this form, and it is going to return us this form as a JavaScript object, as a TypeScript object. So this template reference variable here, it is going to store a reference to this form as a JavaScript object. And then what we also did is, here in the bottom, we have this submit button. And we learned that whenever this submit button will be clicked, the form will be submitted because this input it is of type submit. So whenever this submit button will be clicked, the form will be submitted, and at that time this ng submit event will happen. And when this ng submit event will happen, we are calling this on form submit method. So if I go to app component.ts file, inside this method, we are simply logging the form object. So using this view child decorator, we are accessing the value stored in this registration form template reference variable. Now, what is the value we are storing inside this registration form template reference variable? We are storing this ng form. So this registration form template reference variable, it is going to store a reference of this form element in the form of JavaScript object. And we are logging it when this on form submitted method is called. So when we are logging this form, since it is storing a JavaScript object, it is storing an instance of this ng form. So when we are logging it, it is going to log that ng form in the developer console. And this ng form object, it has a lot of properties which we can make use of in order to work with this form. For example, now what we want is whenever a user enters some data in these form controls, we want to read that data. For that, on this ng form, we have two properties. The first property is this controls property. Currently, if I expand it, you will see that inside this controls property, we don't have any control. For example, in this form, we have several controls like first name input element, last name input element, email input element, this gender radio button, and other input elements. But currently, this controls does not store any of these controls. Also, if I scroll down, we also have this value property. And this value, it is an object. And in this object, we should have a property for each of these controls and the value entered in that control. But currently, we are not seeing those properties. Now, in order to see all these controls inside this controls property and also the value stored in that controls inside this value property, we need to do two things. The first thing which we need to do is on each of these form controls, we need to add a name attribute. So we need to provide a name for each of these form controls. For example, for this input element here, I'll add the name attribute, and to that I'll assign a name for this input element. For example, I'll simply call it as first name. Okay. In the same way, let's also go ahead and let's add this name attribute on other form controls. So I'll add it on this last name input element, and here I'll specify the name as last name. In the same way, let's also add it on this email input element, and there I'll say the name for this input is email. Let's do it on this phone number input, and here I'll say the name is phone. Similarly, here also let's specify a name, and here I'll simply say the name of this control is date of birth. So I'll call it as DOB. Then here we also have this gender radio button. So on each of these radio buttons, so in the web page, we have three radio buttons, male, female, and prefer not to say. So on each of these three radio buttons, I'm going to add a name property. So I'm going to add the name property on this first one. So I'll remove this checked attribute from here. And here I'll say the name is gender. And we need to use the same name on each of these three radio buttons because all these three radio buttons, they belong to the same group. And actually, I have already added a name attribute on each of these radio buttons. So let me remove it from here. Okay, we already have the name attribute on each of these radio buttons. Then if I scroll down, let's also add a name attribute on this street address input element. And here I'll say the name is street 1. Then we also have this street address line 2. There also I'll add this name attribute. Let me remove this required attribute for now. And there let me add this name attribute, and there let's say the name is street 2. Then we also have this drop down, this select box. There also I'll add a name attribute, and there I'll say the name is country. Okay. In the same way, we also have this city input element. From there also I will remove this required attribute, and I'll add this name attribute, and I'll call the name as city. Then we have this input element for storing the region. From there also I'll remove this required attribute and I'll add name attribute, and I'll say the name here is region. Let's do the same thing on this postal code input element. So I'll add a name attribute, and here I'll say the name for this input is postal. And we don't need to add any name attribute on this submit button. Okay, so this is the first thing. On each of the form controls, we need to add this name attribute, and we need to specify a name for that control, because it is with this name the form controls will be created in the ng form object. This is very important to understand. The second thing which we need to do is, on each of these input elements, we also need to add ng model directive. Okay, we have learned about this ng model directive when we talked about two-way data binding. So this ng model, it is provided by form module, and earlier we used it for two-way data binding, but here we are not going to use it for two-way data binding. Here we are simply going to use this ng model directive to tell Angular that this input element, it is a control for this form. So if I save the changes and if we go to the web page, let me clear everything here and let's submit this form. And if I expand this ng form now, and if I expand this controls property here, there you will see that we have a property called first name. Inside this controls object, we have a property called first name, which is of type form control. Okay, and in the same way, if I scroll down to this value property, and if I expand it, there also you will see that in this value object also, we have a property called first name, and its value is empty string. That's because inside this first name input element, we have not entered anything. So initially it is empty string, and that's what is assigned to this first name property here in this value object. And we also have this first name control in the controls object. If I expand this first name control, it is of type form control. If I expand this, there also we should have some properties. For example, the status of this first name control, this form control is valid. This form control is not touched yet, so it is false. Then we also have the value in this form control. So initially it is empty string. If I scroll down, we should have other properties like whether this control is disabled or not. So it is not disabled, so it is false. This control is not dirty yet because we have not entered anything inside this form control. So it should be false. Okay, so in this way, we have all the properties of this first name form control, this first name input element. And we can access these properties using this controls object. In the same way, if you only want to access the value which the user has entered inside this form control, you can go to this value property, and from there you can access that control value using its name. So as you can see, with the name which we have provided for the first name input element, with that name a property has been created inside this value object. In the same way, a property has been created inside this controls object with the name which we have provided for this first name input element. Now you will not see last name, email and other fields here because on those fields we have not used this ng model directive yet. So let's go ahead and let's use this ng model directive on each of those form controls. So on each of these form controls, we are also going to use this ng model directive. And as I mentioned, this ng model directive, it will simply tell Angular that on whichever form control we have used this ng model, it is a control of this form which we are defining here. All right, let's use it on this input element as well, on this input element as well, on this drop down list, on this city input, on this region input, and also on this postal code input. Let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page. Let me clear everything. Let's click on this submit button. Let's expand this ng form object. There we have this controls property. So here we have the controls property. If I expand this controls property, there you will see that for each of those controls with the name of that control, a property has been created. And each of these properties are of type form control. In the same way, if I scroll down and if I expand this value property, there also we have an object, and inside that object we have a property with the form control name and its value. So for example, the name for this country form control, here we have this country form control. So the name for this country form control is country. If I go back, here we have specified a name for that drop down, which is country. So with this name, a property has been created inside this value object, as you can see. And initially, no country has been selected, so it is empty string. But if we go ahead and if we select a country, for example, Japan, and if I submit the form again, you will notice that another instance of this ng form has been logged here. Let's expand it. And there, if I expand this values property and if I expand this value object, you will see that the value of the country is Japan. Okay, so using this value property, we can access the data entered in each of these form controls. Okay, and if we want to work individually with a form control, for that we have this controls property, and there we have each of these form controls as an object. So we can access the form control which we want to work with. For example, if I want to work with this last name input element, I can access it using this last name property, and this is of type form control. And let's say there I want to do something there. Let's say I want to check if that last name input element is valid or not. For that, we should have a property called valid. So here you see we have this property called valid, and currently this valid property is set to true. That's because on this last name, we have not added any validation yet. So by default, this form control will be a valid form control. And that's why you can see its value is true. Okay. So in order to access these form controls inside this ng form object, okay, so in order to access all these form controls inside this ng form object, we have to do two things. The first thing is, for each of the form controls, we need to provide a name. And then on that, we also need to use this ng model directive to tell Angular that this control, it is a control for that form. In this case, it is a control of this form. Now, how are we going to access the value entered in these fields from our code? For that, let's say when the form is submitted, we want to log the value of first name, last name, email, and country in the console. So for that, let's go to app-component.ts file. There, in order to access the form control value, first of all, let me write this console.log statement. And we want to access the value entered in the first name input element. For that, in this form, so first let's access that form property. And this form property is of type ng form. And in this ng form property, we have a property called value. And this value is an object. And in that object, we will have a property called first name, because with this first name, we have an input element where the name is first name. So with this name, we will have a property in the value object. So here we want to access that property value. Okay. In the same way, let me also go ahead and let me access the value for last name, email, and country. So here I want to log last name. Here I want to log email, and here I want to log country. So all these properties, these are the name of a form control. If I save the changes, if we go back to the web page, let me clear everything here and let's enter something. So for example, for the first name, I'll say Manoj. For the last name, I'll say Jha. Email address, let's say abc@gmail.com. Okay. Let's say phone number something 123456778. I'll select a date of birth. I'll select any random date of birth. Gender is male. Street address, I'll enter something. Street address 2, I'll enter something. And let me select a country here. And I'll keep this city, region, and postal code as empty. When I click on this submit button, you will notice that the ng form object has been logged. And also the value for the first name, last name, email, and the country has been logged. So this is how we can access a form control value by using the value property of ng form object. So this dot form here, it is going to return us an object of this ng form. On that we have the value property, and from that value property we can access the form control value by using the name of that form control, because with that name a property will be created inside this value object. And if I go back and if I expand this ng form, if I expand this value, there you will see whatever value we have entered for each of these form controls that we can see here. So we can access the value of each form control from this registration form using the value property of ng form object. Okay. Now using this controls property also, we can access the value of a control. So for example, let's say I want to access the value of this first name form control. For that, we know that this first name is of type form control and it is a property of controls object, and this controls, it is a property of ng form object. So here we can also say, so this dot form, it is going to return us an object of ng form. On that ng form we will have a controls property, right? In that controls property we will have a property called first name, and in that first name we will have a property called value. And here we have this error and it says property first name comes from an index signature, so it must be accessed with first name. So here instead of using dot notation we need to use square bracket notation, and in that square bracket this name should come as a string value, so we need to wrap it within single quotes like this. Okay, and here we don't need to use this dot. All right, so this ng form object, it has a controls property. In that controls property we will have a property called first name, and from that first name form control we want to access its value. If I save the changes, let's see if it works or not. Let me clear everything. Let me click on the submit button, and here it has logged empty string. That's because we have not entered anything in this form. So let's first enter some data in these forms. Okay, I'll select the country and I'll simply click on this submit button. Okay, so now you can see the first name has been logged when we are trying to access it using this controls property. So in this way also you can access a form control value. So this is how we can retrieve a value of a form control using either the value property of this ng form object or by using this controls property of this ng form object. If I go back, let me clear everything here and let me again click on this submit button, so it will log this ng form. There we also have other properties like this dirty property or this disabled property, this enabled property. Then we also have this errors property. We have the status property. We should have a valid property. Okay, so we will talk about all these properties in great detail in our coming lectures. But in the next lecture, let's talk about this dirty property, and let's also talk about this touched property. In the last lecture, we learned about the value and controls property of ng form object. So we learned that when we want to read the value of a form control, for that we can use the value property of the form control object, and it will give us all the value of all the form controls from a given form. Then we also talked about controls property, and in this controls property each of these controls of this form will be created as an object of form control, and that object will also have some properties, like it has the property called disabled, which says whether the form control is disabled or not. It has this invalid property which tells whether the form control has an invalid value or a valid value. Okay. In the same way, we also have this untouched property for the form control. So in this lecture, we are going to talk about the touched and untouched property and also the dirty property of a form and a form control. So a form is considered as touched if any of its control has been focused. For a touched form, its touched property will be true and its untouched property will be false. Here, currently, this form is not touched because none of its controls has been focused. So you will notice that for this ng form, we have a property called touched and we also have a property called untouched. If I see the value of this touched property, currently it is false because none of its controls has been focused and its untouched property is true. Now, let me go ahead and let me clear the console here and let me focus inside any one of these controls. So for example, I will focus inside this street address control. Now if I submit the form and if I expand this ng form object, now you will notice that this touched is true and this untouched is false. That's because this form is touched now. One of its controls had been focused. So when you want to do something when a form is touched, you can use this touched or untouched property of this ng form object. For example, let's say whenever this form is touched, that means whenever one of its control is focused, we want to set some shadow for this form container. So if I go to VS Code, there we are displaying that form container using this section. And for that, the class is container. Now what I want is when this form is touched, that means whenever one of its control is focused, we want to set some shadow for this section. For that, if I go to appcomponent.css, there I have created this CSS class called form shadow, and I want to add this form shadow CSS class dynamically on this section element whenever the form is touched. So first of all, here I'm going to use the ng class directive, and to this ng class directive, we need to assign a TypeScript expression. Here we need to assign an object. In that object, we need to specify what CSS class we want to add or remove. In this case, I want to add this form shadow CSS class. So we need to pass this as a string. So within these single quotes, I'm going to specify the CSS class name. After that, we need to use a colon, and then we need to specify a TypeScript expression which should return a Boolean value. If that expression returns true, in that case, this CSS class will be added on this section. But if it returns false, in that case, this CSS class, it will not get added to this section. So here I want to set the value stored in the touched property of ng form. Now we have that ng form inside this registration form template reference variable, because if you notice, to this registration form template reference variable, we are assigning this ng form. So it is going to store an instance of ng form class. It is going to store an object of type ng form. So let's make use of this. So here I'll say registration form dot, and it will have a touched property. So if the form is touched, in that case, we want to set this CSS class for this section. If I save the changes and if you go to the web page, let me clear everything here. So initially you will not see any shadow here, but if I click inside any of these controls, for example inside the street address, and if I click outside, you will see that there is some shadow added to this container. So this is a simple use case to demonstrate how we can use the touched property of ng form object. Now just like this form has a touched and untouched property, if I click on this submit button, you will notice that this ng form has been logged and it has a touched and untouched property. In the same way, each form control in this form will also have an untouched property. So if I expand this controls property, there, let's expand one of the controls. For example, let's expand this first name control. And if I scroll down, there also you will see that we have this touched property, which is currently false because this first name has not been focused. And we also have the untouched property. Okay, and this untouched property will be true because, as I said, since this first name text box has not been focused, it is not touched. This form control will be considered touched only after it has been focused. So currently, since this first name form control has not been focused, its touched property is false and its untouched property is true. But let me clear the console here and let me click inside this first name control, and now let me submit. And now when I expand this ng form, there if I expand this controls, and there if I expand this first name control, now you will notice that touched is true because this first name input element has been focused, and untouched is false. So a form control is considered as touched if the form control has been focused. For a touched form control, its untouched property will be false and its touched property will be true. Then, for a form, we also have a property called dirty. Now, a form is considered as dirty if any one of its control value has changed. For a dirty form, its dirty property will be true. In the same way, each form control also has a dirty property. So, a form control is considered as dirty if that form control value has changed. So currently, if I focus inside this first name text box, this form will be considered as touched because one of its control has been focused, but it will not be considered as dirty. It will be considered as dirty only if the value has changed from its previous value. For example, if I type something inside this first name, now the value of a form control has changed. And since the value of a form control has changed, the complete form will be considered as dirty. Okay, so if I clear the console here, if I click on the submit button and if I expand this ng form, now you will notice that this dirty property is true because one of its form controls value has changed. But let me refresh the page here. Let me clear the console. And if I only focus inside this first name text box and if I don't change its value, so if I don't enter anything inside this first name text box, and now when I click on this submit button, the form is touched because one of its control has been focused. So this touched property will be true and untouched property will be false. But its dirty property will be still false because none of its form controls value has changed. Okay, in the same way, on the control level also, so if I expand this controls object and let's say if I expand this city form control, there the dirty property for that city form control will also be false because the value has not changed. We have not changed the value of this city form control. But if I enter something inside this city, for example, let's say London, okay, let me clear this console here. And now when I click on this submit button, and if I expand this ng form, and there if I expand this controls property, and there if I expand this city form control, you will notice that there now the dirty property will be true because the value for this city form control has changed. So a form control will be considered as dirty if that form control's value has changed. And if any one of the form control is dirty, that means the complete form is dirty. So in simple terms, if any of the form control value changes, that makes the complete form dirty. And one of the use cases where we can use this dirty property is when we want to use can deactivate route card. So in the routing section, we learned that we can use can deactivate route card if we want to allow or restrict a user from navigating away from the current route. And one of the use cases where we can use a can deactivate route card is when the user has filled up the form and without submitting the form, he's trying to navigate away. In that case, we can use this dirty property to check if the form is dirty. That means if the user has inputted something inside any one of the form controls, and if the user has not saved the changes, we can use this dirty property to check when the user is trying to navigate. If the form is dirty, we will ask user whether he really wants to navigate away or he want to save the changes first. So this is one use case where we can use this dirty property of this ng form object. So I hope now you know what is the use of the dirty property and what is the use of the touched and untouched property of a form. In the same way, we have other properties like disabled. So if the form is disabled, in that case, this disabled property will be true, otherwise it will be false. And this enabled property will be true if the form is enabled. So currently the form is enabled, but this enabled property will be false if the form is disabled. Then we have other properties like valid. So if the form is valid, that means when we use validation on the form controls, and in each form control, if the user has entered a valid value, in that case, this valid will be true. Otherwise, if any one of the form control has an invalid value, in that case, this valid property of this ng form will be false. And we will understand this valid property in great detail when we will talk about form validation. This is all from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day. In this lecture, you will learn how to work with radio buttons in a template-driven form in Angular. So in this form, the user has an option to select his gender. And the genders are basically radio buttons here. So we have this male radio button, we have this female radio button, and we have this button, prefer not to say. Now, let me go ahead and let me enter some value in these form controls. Okay, and let me also select the gender as male. Let me clear the console here. And when I click on this submit button, if I expand this ng form and if I expand this value here, you will notice that the first name, last name, and email is properly calculated. And we are also able to read the value of this gender radio button. So currently it is male, so the gender value is male. If I clear the console here, if I select gender as female, and if I click on the submit button, and if I expand this ng form, and if we check the value of gender there you will notice that the gender is female. So it is working as expected. Now, when we are working with a template-driven form in Angular, we can surely create the radio buttons like this, like we are doing here. But what we can also do is, instead of repeating this HTML 3 times, we can use ng for directive and we can loop over an array in order to display the genders. So for example, in the app component.ts, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to create an array. So let's say genders. Okay, this is going to be an array, and to this genders, I'm going to assign an array. And inside this array, I'm going to have 3 objects. In this object, I'm going to have an ID property. Let's say ID is going to be 1. And I'm also going to have a value property. Okay, and the value is going to be male. So this object I'm creating for gender male. In the same way, let me also go ahead and let me create 2 more objects. Here I'll say ID is 2 and I'm keeping these values as string value because when we are going to use it in the HTML, there we are going to assign these values to the ID attribute, and there in the HTML those values will be a string value. So that's why I'm creating it as string value. Here let's say the value is female, and here I will say the value is maybe other. And let's also include one more property, let's say display. Okay, so what do we want to display in the UI? So here for the male, I'll display male. Let me copy this property here and let's go ahead and let's create this display property for female. So for the female, I want to display female, and here for this other gender, I want to display this text, prefer not to say. So let me copy it and let me paste it here. Now what we are going to do is we are going to loop over this genders array in the view. So I will remove these 2 divs. Okay. And what do we want to do? We want to repeat this div for each gender. So here I'm going to use ng for directive. And using this ng for directive, we want to loop over the genders array. So here let's create a variable. Let's call it maybe gen of genders. And now what we want to do here for the ID, instead of displaying this string value check male, for the male gender, I want to have the value as 1. Or maybe let's use the same value, because using these IDs, I'm also adding some CSS on these radio buttons. So here let's say for the male, the ID is check male. For the female, the ID is check female. And for this other, let's say the ID is check other. All right, now let's save the changes here. Let's go back. So here we want to display the ID from the genders array. So here I'm going to use string interpolation syntax. Okay, or since we are going to assign these values to an attribute, here we can also do property binding. So let me actually do property binding here. Okay, and what do we want to assign to this id attribute? We want to assign gen.id. Okay, then here for the value, again I'll do property binding, and here I'll say the value should be gen.value, because for each gender, you'll notice we have this value property. Then we also has this display. So here, instead of hard coding this value, here I'll use string interpolation syntax, and there I'll say gen.display. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page and let's see if it is working or not. So you will notice that we still have those genders, so male, female, and prefer not to say. But now what we are doing is we have created a genders property, which is an array. And inside that array, we have defined an object for each gender. There we have the ID property, value property, and display property. And we are using these properties in the view to set the ID attribute of the radio button, the value attribute of the radio button, and what do we want to display in the web page. And we are basically looping over that genders array to display each gender from that genders array. All right, now let's quickly check if it is still reading the value correctly or not. So let me select the gender as male here. Let me clear the console and let's click on the submit button. If I expand this ng form here, if I go to this value property and if I expand it, you'll see that it is still reading the gender value properly. So it has read male. Let me clear the console. Let me select female and let's click on the submit button. If I expand this and if I check the value, there the gender is female. So it is still reading the value properly. And in this way, so far in this section, we have learned how to create a template driven form and how to read the value of a form control from a template driven form by using ng form object. Now in this lecture, let's learn how we can do form validation on a template driven form. So for this ng form object, you will notice that we also have a valid property. And this valid property simply tells whether a form is valid or not. Now, when will be a form valid? Well, let's say on each of these controls, we have added some validation. So for example, let's say this first name, last name, and email is a required field. Now, if the user enters some value for these fields, okay, in that case, all these three controls have valid values now. And since only on these three controls we have added validation, this form will be valid. Now, if any one of these form controls on which we have added validation, if it does not contain a valid value, in that case, that form control will be invalid as well as the complete form will also be invalid. So for example, if I don't specify an email here, in that case, for this first name, we have provided a valid value. For the last name also, we have provided a valid value. But for the email, we are not providing a valid value. In that case, this email control, it will be invalid. And since it is invalid, the complete form here is invalid. Okay, so on the form level, we have this valid property which tells whether the form is valid or not. And we also have this invalid property. So if the form is valid, in that case, this invalid property will be false and valid property will be true. But if the form is invalid, in that case, this valid property will be false and invalid property will be true. Now, when a form will be invalid? Only when one of its controls on which we have added validation does not contain a valid value. Now, if I go to this controls property, there we have each of these controls in the form as a property and they are of type form control. And on each of these form controls also, we have the valid and invalid property. So you can see we have this valid property on the form control and also the invalid property. So a form control will be valid if on that form control we have added a validation and in that form control we are providing a proper value. And the form control will be invalid if on that form control some kind of validation has been added and it does not contain a valid value. Let's try to understand this with an example. So what I want is, I want to make this first name, last name and this email field as a required field. So whenever the form will be submitted, these three controls must have a value. So let's see how we can add this type of validation in a template driven form. Now, as we have learned earlier, in a template driven form, we do everything in the HTML template. So here we have our form, and in that form, here we have the first name input element. Now I want to make this input element as a required field. So user must enter a value inside this first name form control. For that, we are going to use the HTML required attribute, and this will simply make this input as a required field. In the same way, I also want to make this last name as a required field. So there also I'll use this required attribute, and I'm also going to add this required attribute on this email field. So this email should also be required. Now let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let me clear everything. And if I don't enter anything inside this first name, last name and email, and if I click on the submit button, let's expand this ng form object. Now you will notice here the valid is set to false because now this form is not valid. And why it is not valid? Because on this first name, last name and email, we have added a validator called required, which makes these three controls as a required field. And since we have not entered any value in these required fields, these three controls are invalid. They don't have a valid data, so they are invalid. And as we learned earlier, if any one control of a form is invalid, in that case, the complete form is invalid. That's why you can see this valid property of the form is false and its invalid property will be true because currently this form is invalid. In the same way, if we expand these controls, there if we expand this first name, there also you will see that the valid property is false because on this first name control, we have added a validator, we have make it a required field, and since we are not entering any value in this field, it does not contain a valid value. And that's why this control is invalid. And hence this valid property is false and its invalid property will be true. And same will be the case for last name. So there also this valid property will be false and its invalid property will be true. And in the same way, on the email also we have added a validation. And there also we are not entering any value. So its valid property will be false and its invalid property will be true. But let's say if I expand this city, on this city field, we have not added any validation, right? So even if we don't enter any value inside this city field, it is going to have a valid value because on this we have not added any validation. So any value which we enter here, even if it is an empty string, it is going to be a valid value. So that's why if I expand this city control, there you will see that the valid property is true. Now, if I go ahead and if I enter some value in these fields, so let's say first name is Manoj, last name is Jha, and let's enter some email. Let's say abc@gmail.com. And now if I submit this form, only on these three controls we have added a validator. So each of these three controls contains a valid value, right? On the other form controls, we have not added any validator. So by default, these controls will be valid. So in this way, all the form controls of this form has a valid value. In that case, this form will be valid. So if I submit the form now, and if I expand this ng form object, now you will notice that valid is true and invalid is false. In the same way, if we check each of the controls also on which we have added validation, so for example, this first name control, there also you will see that the valid property of that control is true and the invalid property is false. Same will be the case for last name as well. There also the valid will be true and invalid will be false. And same is the case with email. So here also the valid property will be true and invalid property will be false. But if I don't enter a value in any one of the controls where we have added a validation, for example, if I remove this value from here from the email field, now we are only entering value in the first name required field and the last name required field. But this email is also a required field. But here we are not entering a value. So in this case, this email control will be invalid. And since one of the controls of this form is invalid, the complete form will be invalid. So let me clear the console here. Let me click on the submit button. And if I expand this ng form, you will notice that the form is invalid. So the valid property is false and invalid property is true. But if I expand this controls, there you will see that for the first name and last name, since we have provided a value, the valid property will be true and invalid property will be false. But on the email, since it is a required field, but we are not providing any value, its valid property will be false and its invalid property will be true. So in this way, we can know which form control has an invalid value or valid value. And in this way, we will also come to know whether a form is a valid form or not. And again, a form will be considered as valid whenever all its control has a valid value. All right. Now, another thing which I want to show you here is, let's say inside this email field, I enter some value, some random value. Okay. So I'm entering some random value in the email field, but this is not a valid email, right? But since this field is a required field, and in that required field, we have entered some value. If I click on this submit button, you will see that the valid property of the form is true. And if I also expand the controls and if I expand the email form control here, there also the valid property is true. Why? Because on this form control, we have added required validator, and required validator will only check if in that field, if in that control, we have a value or not. Here we have some value in this field. So that's why this form control is considered as valid form control. But in this form control, we are not entering a valid value. So we also want to check whether the value entered in this email field is a valid email address or not. If it is not a valid email address, in that case, this form control should be considered invalid. For that, we can use another HTML attribute for validation, which is email. So on this email field, I'm going to add another validator called email. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now let's enter first name, last name, and some invalid email address. Okay. Now when I submit the form, since inside this email field, we have not entered a valid email address, we have entered some value, but we have not entered a valid email address. In that case, this form control is not valid, so it will make complete form invalid. So now this form should be invalid, and that's why the valid property is false and the invalid property will be true. So you see, invalid property is true. Let's also check it on the control level. So let's expand this email form control. There also you will see that the valid property is false and invalid property is true. That's because now on this email field, we have two validators, the required validator and the email validator. And both these validators should be satisfied. Then only this form control will be valid. So now if I go ahead and if I enter a valid email address, abc@gmail.com, so it is a valid email address. Now if I submit the form, now inside this email field, we have entered some value and we have entered a valid email address. So now this form control should be valid. Let's check it. So let's expand this controls property. There, let's expand this email property. And now the valid property is true, because now in this form control, we are entering some value and that value is a valid email address. So that's why now this email form control is valid. And since now all the form controls are valid in this form, on the form level also, if we check the valid property, it should be true. Now let's see a practical use case of this valid property of this form. So what we want is, if the form is valid, that means if all the form controls in that form has a valid value, then only we want to enable this submit button and user should be able to submit the form. If the form is not valid, in that case, this submit button should be disabled. Let's see how we can achieve that. So let's go to VS Code. And what we want is, we want to disable this submit button when the form is invalid. So here I'm going to use this disabled attribute, and we are going to do a property binding here. And to this, we are going to assign an expression which will return a Boolean value true or false. And here we want to use the valid property of ng form. Now, where do we have the ng form? If I scroll up to this registration form template reference variable, we are assigning this ng form. So this registration form variable, it is going to store a reference to this ng form object. And using that reference, we can access the value property of ng form. So let me copy this and let's scroll down, and here to this disabled property, we are going to assign some TypeScript expression. So here I will say registration form dot valid, because this registration form, it is storing an object of ng form, and in that object we have this valid property. So we want to disable this submit button when the form is not valid. So here I'll use not operator like this. You can also use invalid property here. So if I use invalid property here, in that case we don't need to use this not operator. But if you use valid property, in that case we will have to use this not operator, because if the form is valid, we don't want to disable the form. We only want to disable the form when the form is invalid. So when the form will be valid, this valid will return true. Otherwise, it will return false. So that's why we are using this not operator on it. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page, and you will notice that now this submit button is disabled. Now, how I say that this submit button is disabled? Because if I click on this submit button, you will see that ng form object is not being logged. So this submit button, the click functionality is not working here because it is disabled right now. Only if we enter some valid value in the form. So only on these three controls we have added a validator. So now these three controls has a valid value, and other controls by default is valid. So now this submit button should be enabled. So now when I click on this submit button, now this ng form object is being logged. But if I remove this value from here, so now the form is invalid because one of the controls on which we have added the validation, it does not contain a valid value. So this form is invalid. And when the form is invalid, this submit button is disabled. So when I click on this submit button now, you will not see ng form object logged. But if I enter some valid value and when I click on this submit button, this ng form has been logged here. So the form can be submitted now. All right, now let's do one more thing. Let's inspect one of the controls from this form. So let's go to this elements tab, and there we have the HTML of this form. Let me go ahead and let me expand this app root. Let me expand this section, and let me expand this form. And in that form, let me expand this div. And in this div, we have this first name input element, and we also have this last name input element. So let's examine this first name input element. Now on this first name input element, if you see, the name for this input element is first name. Okay, so on this first name input element, you will see some CSS classes added. So here you see this class attribute. Here you will see on this first name, there are some CSS classes added like ng dirty, ng valid, and ng touched. So let me actually refresh the page. Okay, and yeah, so you will see that now since we have refreshed the page, this first name, it is not touched. We have not focused inside this first name. It is also not dirty because its value is not changed, and it is currently invalid because we have not entered any value in this first name field. So this first name field, it is a required field, but we have not entered any value inside this first name field. So currently it is invalid. And for that, you will see that some CSS classes has been added. So ng touched has been added because currently this control has not been touched. ng pristine has been added because the value of this first name has not changed from its previous value. And also ng invalid CSS class has been added because this field, it is a required field, but we have not entered any value inside this field. Now just notice what happens when I click inside this first name form control and when I click outside of it. You will notice that ng untouched CSS class has been removed and ng touched CSS class has been added. Okay, but ng pristine and ng invalid is still there. Now, if I go ahead and if I enter something inside this text box, let's say my name, now you will notice that ng pristine has been removed and ng dirty has been added because now the value of this first name form control has changed from its previous value. So that's why this form control is now dirty. So ng pristine CSS class has been removed and ng dirty CSS class has been added. In the same way, now this first name form control contains a valid value. It is not empty. And that's why ng invalid CSS class has been removed and ng valid CSS class has been added. And same is the case with other controls. If I expand this last name input element here, there also currently you will see that ng untouched, ng pristine and ng invalid CSS classes has been added, because this form control, this last name form control, it is not touched. Its value has not changed from its previous value, and it does not contain a valid value. This field is a required field, so it should have some value. But currently it does not have any value, so it is invalid. But as soon as I click inside this last name, and when I click outside, you will see that ng untouched will be removed. So just notice, okay, ng untouched has been removed and ng touched has been added. And if I add some value here, you will notice that ng pristine and ng invalid has been removed and ng dirty and ng valid has been added. So this is how Angular knows whether the form control is touched or not, whether the form control has a valid value or not, and whether the form control is dirty or not. And we can make use of these CSS classes to our advantage. We can use it to do something with the form. Let's understand that in our next lecture. In this lecture, let's learn how we can show a custom validation error message whenever there is some invalid data in a form control. So in the last lecture, we learned that for each form control, Angular adds some CSS classes on that form control based on whether that form is touched or it is dirty or it is valid or not. For example, for this first name input element, as you can see, some CSS classes has been added like ng untouched, ng pristine and ng invalid. That's because this form control, this first name form control, it has not been touched. So this ng untouched CSS class has been added. Its value has not changed. So this ng pristine CSS class has been added, and it has some invalid value because this first name is a required field. So it should have some value. It cannot be empty string. And that's why ng invalid CSS class has been added on this first name input element. Now, if I focus inside this first name input element, and now if I click somewhere outside, in that case, this form control is touched. So you see, ng untouched CSS class has been removed and ng touched CSS class has been added. In the same way, if I enter some data inside this first name form control, you will notice that ng pristine and ng invalid has been removed and ng dirty and ng valid CSS class has been added on this first name input element. And we can make use of these CSS classes to our advantage. For example, what I want is when there is some invalid data inside this first name input element, I want to show its border in red. For that, let's go to VS Code and let's go to app-component.css, and there let's first create a CSS class. And the CSS class name must be ng invalid, because this ng invalid CSS class gets added to the form control when it is not valid. So in this first name form control, currently you will see that ng invalid CSS class has been added because this form control does not have a valid value. It is a required field, so it should have some valid value. But currently it contains empty string. That's why on this form control, this ng invalid has been added. So we are making use of this ng invalid CSS class. Okay, so here we have created this ng invalid CSS class, and when on a form control we have this ng invalid CSS class added, at that time we want to show the border in red. So here I am going to set the border property, and there I will say the border should be red, it should be 2 pixel and it should be solid. Now if I save the changes and if we go to the web page, you will notice that since the form is invalid, because this first name, last name and email is a required field and we have not entered any value for this first name, last name and email, so the form is invalid. And since the form is invalid, the form has this red border. But we do not want to show the red border on the form. Instead, we want to show the red border on the form controls, on these input elements. So here I'll change the CSS class a little bit. So before this ng invalid, we'll also include input. So if the form control is of input type, and on that form control, if this ng invalid CSS class is added, then we want to show its border in red. With this, if we save the changes, if we go to the web page, you will not see the border of these form controls in red. That's because if I go back and if I scroll up, here you will notice that on that input element, we are adding a border. So what I will do is I will comment this line. Okay, so after this border is getting added using this ng invalid, after that, this CSS class was being overridden by this line. That's why the border color was not changing. But now if I save the changes and if you go to the web page, now you should see that the border color is in red. But for other controls, the border color is now black because we have removed that CSS class which was setting the border for these controls to gray. Anyway, I will leave it like this. So as you can see, the border colors are now changed to red whenever the form control has invalid value. But if I enter something in these form controls, now you will notice that that red border has been removed. Now, what I want is initially when the form loads, this web page loads, that time I don't want to show the red border. I only want to show the red border on invalid form controls when that form control is focused and without entering any valid value in that form control, user clicks somewhere else. That time only I want to show this red border. For that, we can also use the ng touched CSS class. So what we want is if the form control is touched and if it has invalid value, then only we want to show this red border. So let's again go back and let's change the CSS class a little bit. So what we want is when the form control is of type input and on that form control we have this ng invalid CSS class and also on that we have this ng touched CSS class. That means when the form control is touched. So it should be ng touched. Then only we want to show this red border. With this, if we save the changes, if we go back to the web page, initially you will see we don't have the red border, but if I click inside this first name text box and if I don't enter any valid value and if I click outside, now you will see that its border has changed to red. In the same way, this last name, it is also a required field. So currently it does not have a valid value, but since this last name control is not touched yet, we don't see this red border. But if I touch this form control and if I don't enter a valid value and if I click outside, its border color has also changed to red. But if I go ahead and if I enter some valid value, in that case, what will happen is the ng invalid CSS class will be removed. And when the ng CSS class will be removed, its border will not get set to red. Because in order to set this border red, the form control should have this ng invalid CSS class as well as this ng touched CSS class. Okay. The next thing what I want is if the form control does not have a valid value, in that case, I also want to show a custom validation error message. For that, let's go to VS Code. Let's go to appcomponent.html and here we have our form. After this input element, let me go ahead and let me add another div. In this div, I'm going to use this small tag and here I will say first name is a required field. Okay, let me also show an asterisk before this. All right, now on this small element, I want to add some CSS class. So let's go to appcomponent.css and all I want to do is I want to show the text color in red and font weight, it should be bold. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. So here you can see it says first name is a required field. Now let me actually go ahead and let me move this div inside this div where we are defining this input element. So maybe here. Let's save the changes now. Let's go back to the web page. And now it is showing just below this first name form control. Okay, so it says first name is a required field. Now I don't want to show this error message always. I only want to show this error message when the user has touched this form control and he has not entered a valid value there. Let's see how we can achieve that. So let's go back to VS Code, and what I'm going to do is on this first name input element. So first of all, let me move these attributes in a separate line so that it will be more readable. And on that, I'm going to add a template reference variable. For that, we use a pound sign and we specify a name. And I'm going to call this template reference variable fname. So in this way, this fname will store a reference to this input element in the DOM. But there it is going to return us this input element HTML. But here, I want this input element as a JavaScript object. For that, to this fname, what we can do is we can assign ng model. Okay, so we learned that when we use this ng model, it tells Angular that this input element is a form control for this form. So this ng model, in this case, it is going to store a reference to this input element in the form of JavaScript object. So basically, in this case, if I click on this submit button, so this submit button is not working because currently it is disabled. So let me enter some valid value in these forms. And now when I click on this submit button, here in this controls property, we have this first name form control. So this first name form control, it will be assigned to this fname reference variable when we are assigning this ng model to it. So for this form control, this ng model, it is going to store a reference to this first name form control, and we are assigning that to this fname template reference variable. So this fname template reference variable, it is storing a reference to this fname form control. And on this fname form control, we have this valid property and we also have a touched property. Okay, so we are going to make use of these properties of this form control. So let's go to VS Code. So what we want is we only want to display this message if this form control is touched and if it does not has a valid value. So let's go back to VS Code, and on this small element, I'm going to use ng if directive, and here we will check. So I'm going to make use of this template reference variable. So here we want to check if that form control is invalid. So we will say fname dot invalid. Again, this fname, it is going to store a reference to this input element in the form of JavaScript object. So there we want to check if the fname is invalid, and if it is touched, then only we want to display this error message. So again, I'll say fname dot touched. Okay, so if the first name input element is invalid and it is touched, then only we want to display this error message. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. So now you will see initially that error message is not being displayed. But if I click inside this first name form control, and if I don't enter any valid value, and if I click outside, now you will see that the border of that form control is red, and it is also showing this error message, first name is a required field. Let's do the same thing for last name as well as email field. So I'll copy this div and I'll paste it for the last name, and I'll also paste it for this email field. Okay, and now let's modify this error message. So here let's say last name is a required field, and on this last name also let's add a template reference variable. Let's call it lname, and now instead of using this fname reference variable, we are going to use lname. In the same way, here also let's modify this error message. Here let's say entered email is not valid. Okay, and on this email input element also let's add a template reference variable. Let's call it email, and let's use this email template reference variable here and here. Now currently this email template reference variable, it is going to store a reference to this input element and it will return us the HTML of that input element. But here we don't want the HTML. We want the JavaScript object for that input element. So to this email, we also need to assign ng model. Same thing we need to do for lname because we want this last name form control in the form of a JavaScript object. So here also let's assign ng model. Okay, let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page and let's see if it works. So if I click inside this last name and if I click outside, you will see that message. Last name is a required field. But if I enter a valid value inside this last name, then that error message is gone. In the same way, if I click inside this email field, but if I don't enter any value and if I click outside, we see this message, entered email is not valid. And the border is also red for that form control. But if I enter a valid value, in that case, that error is gone. Now, if you want, you can also add the validation for other controls as well. But here I'm not going to do that because if I start adding validation for each of these form controls, this video will become quite lengthy. So please do this as your own and consider it as an assignment. All right. Finally, what we can also do is we can also do two-way data binding on these form controls. Let's see how we can do that. And doing that is very easy and we already know it from our previous lectures. So on this first name, last name and email, I also want to do two-way data binding. For that, I'm going to create three properties here. I'm going to create this first name property. It is going to be of type string and initially let me assign it with empty string. In the same way, let's create last name property. It is also going to be of type string and initially it will be empty string. Let's also create a property called email. Again, it is going to be of type string and initially it will be empty string. Now we are going to do two-way data binding using these properties. So I'll copy this first name property. Let's go to app-component.html and on that first name input element, so here we have the first name input element, there we are using this ng model directive. So in order to do two-way data binding, first we need to wrap it within square brackets like this, and then we also need to wrap it within parenthesis. And then to this, we need to assign a TypeScript expression. Here we are going to assign this first name property to this ng model directive. Let's do the same thing for the last name. So let me move it to a separate line so that it will be more readable. And again, here I will do two-way data binding. And to this, I'll assign last name. And let's do the same thing for email. So I'll move it to a separate line first. And then I'm going to do two-way data binding. And to this, I'll assign email property. Okay. And here the property name is last name where n is caps. So let me copy this property name here and let's assign it here. So in this way, we are doing two-way data binding. Now what we want is whenever the user start entering something in these controls, we also want to show what the user is entering. Okay, so for that, let me add a span. And here, let's say you entered and then the value which the user has entered. So that value we are going to receive inside this first name property, right? So we want to show the value of that first name property here. I'm going to do the same thing for last name and email. So here also, after the small element, let's add this span and here we want to display the value stored in last name. Okay, and here the property name is first name. So n should be caps here. Let's do the same thing for email. So again, I'll copy this, scroll down, and here we are displaying the email. And here, let's use the email property. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And here we have an error. Okay, if I open command prompt here, it says, so here also we have an error and basically the building has failed. So it says cannot assign value $event to template variable email. Okay, template variables are read only. I think the issue is because here the template reference variable name and the property name is same. So what I will do is I'll change the property name here to maybe email address. Okay, and let's use this property. So here to this ng model, we'll assign email address, and here we will display the value of email address. Let's save the changes now. Let's go to command prompt, and now the compilation is successful. Let's go to the web page. Let's reload the page here. All right. So here you can see now it says you entered and it's showing empty string because inside this first name we have not entered anything. If I say Manoj, then you will see that it says you entered Manoj. In the same way here, if I say Jha, it says you entered Jha. If I enter some email address, it says you entered and the email address which we have inserted inside this email field. So it is working as expected. Now, the one thing which is left here is I don't want to display this message you entered if the user has not touched this form control and he has not entered any value. I only want to show this when the user has typed some value in these form controls. Doing that is very easy. All we have to do is on this span element, we need to use ngIf, and to this we are going to assign this property name. So if this property name has some value, in that case this span element will be displayed. But if it is empty string, if it does not have any value, in that case this span element will not be displayed. Okay, let's go ahead and let's do the same thing on other two spans which we have added for first name and last name. So here as well as here. Now for the last name, we want to check the value of last name property. So here to this ngIf, we will assign last name property. And here for the first name to this ngIf, we are going to assign first name property. So this property. Okay, so if the first name has some value, in that case, this span will be displayed. Otherwise, if the first name is empty string, if it does not have any value, then in that case, this span element will not be displayed. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Okay, so initially you see that span element is not being displayed. But as soon as we start typing something, then only it is showing that span you entered and the value entered in that form control. Okay. So in this way, we can do form validation and we can show some custom error messages whenever the form control does not contain a valid value. In this lecture, we are going to learn how we can group some of the form controls together into a single group. Now, the first question which will come to your mind is why we would want to group some of the form controls together. Well, in some of the applications, you might have seen that some of the form controls are grouped together, and any one of that form control contains an invalid value, then we show a validation error message saying that one of the input fields does not contain a valid value. So here, instead of doing the validation on each form control, we do it on a group level. So this is one use case where we might want to group some of the form controls together and perform the validation on that group instead of doing the validation on each of the form controls. So a form group is basically a collection of form controls, and it can also contain other form groups as well. And to create a form group, we can use a directive called as ngModel group. Now we create a form group to organize and manage related form controls together. We can track the value and validity state of form control instances present inside that form group by creating a form group. Let's try to understand how we can group some of the form controls together in a template-driven form in Angular. Currently, if you see, for each of these form controls, inside this controls property, there is a property created with the name of that form control. And the type of these properties are form control. So for each of these form controls which we have in the form, for that an object of type form control has been created, right? And if I scroll down, we also have this values property here, which contains an object, and in that object, for each of these form controls, we have provided a name. So with that name, a property has been created, and the value entered in those form controls has been assigned to those respective properties. Now in this form, we are also trying to get the address details of the user. So for the address, we are specifying these 6 input elements. So the user can enter street address 2, country, city, region, and postal code. So all these form controls, we are using it to get the address details of the user. So what we can do is we can group these form controls together, and then we can perform validation on these form controls together. Now, the first question which will come to your mind is how we can group these form controls together. Let's see that. Let's go to VS Code and let me scroll down. So from here, we are displaying the form controls for getting the address detail. Okay, so inside this div, we have created other divs, and inside those divs, we have all the form controls related to address. So this div is a container div for each of these address related form controls. So what we can do is on this container div, which is containing other form controls related to address, we are going to use a directive called ngModel group. Okay, and to this directive, we can provide a name. So let's say the name for this group, I'm going to specify it as address. And this G, it should be in caps. So with this, if I save the changes now, and if we go to the web page, let me clear the console here. Let's enter some value in this first name, last name, and email address. And when I click on this submit button, you will notice that ng form has been logged here. And if I expand this ng form object, there, if I expand this controls, you will see that we have this date of birth field, email field, first name field, gender field, last name, and phone field. And all these are of type form control. And apart from that, we also have this address field, and it is of type form group. Now from where this name address is coming? Well, if I go back here to this ng model group, we are assigning a value called address. So with that name, a property has been created here, and to this property, a form group has been assigned. So we are creating this form group using this ng model group directive. So it has created a form group, and if I expand that form group, you will see that this form group, it is a collection of form controls. So if I scroll down here, you can see that we have this controls property, and if I expand the controls property of this form group, of this address form group, there you will see we have the city form control, the country form control, postal form control, region form control, street 1 form control, and street 2 form control. So now all these form controls in this form, it is grouped together inside a form group, and we are calling that form group address. Now, apart from this controls property for this form group, if I scroll down, you will see that we have other properties as well. For example, on the form group level also, we have this valid and invalid property. So if any control in that form group has an invalid value, in that case, this valid property will be false and invalid property will be true. But if all the controls in that form group contains a valid value, then the invalid property will be false and the valid property will be true. So currently on these form controls, we have not added any validation. So by default, all these form controls have a valid value. And since all these form controls have a valid value, you will see that for that form group, for this address form group, the valid property is true and the invalid property is false. Then we also have other properties like dirty. We also have property like untouched, and we should also have a property called touched. So here we have this property called touched. It is false because none of these form controls have been touched yet. Okay, so just like how we have these properties on form level, on form control level, in the same way, we also have all these properties on form group level. And we can make use of these properties to validate a form group. And we will see that in a bit. Then if I go to this elements tab here, and here, let me scroll down, and we should have a form group. So here you can see on this div, we have this ng model group. So this div is the container div which contains all our grouped form controls. Okay. And on this container div also, you will see that Angular has added some CSS classes. For example, on this form group also, it has added this CSS class ng untouched, ng pristine, and ng valid. Okay. Now, if I touch any of the form controls inside the form group, so for example, if I touch this street address 2 and if I click outside, you will notice that ng untouched CSS class has been removed and ng touched CSS class has been added. And if I enter some value in any one of the form control, you will notice that ng pristine CSS class has been removed and ng dirty CSS class has been added. So using these CSS classes, we can also identify whether any one of the form control of a form group has been touched or not, because if any control of a form group will be touched, in that case on that form group this ng touched CSS class will be added. We can also check if all the form controls of a form group has a valid value or not. Because if any of the form control in a form group has an invalid value, in that case on that form group ng invalid CSS class will be added. Only if all the form controls of that form group contains valid value, then only this ng valid CSS class will be added on that form group. And we can also check if the value of any form control in a form group has changed. So if none of the form controls value has changed, in that case ng pristine CSS class will be added on that form group. Otherwise, ng dirty CSS class will be added on that form group. And we can make use of these CSS classes for our own advantage. To do that, let's first go ahead and let's first add some validators on some of the form groups. So what I want is this street address one, it should be a required field. This country should be a required field. City, it is required field. Region, it can be optional, but postal code, it is a required field. So this street address one, city, country, and postal code, these four fields should be a required field. So let's go back to VS Code and let's add the required attribute on each of those fields. So the street address one, it should be a required field. So I'll use this required attribute here to make this field a required field. In the same way, this country, it should be a required field. So here also I'll add this required attribute. Then we also want to make this city field as required field. So there also I'll use this required attribute. This region field can be optional, but this postal code field, it should be required field. So here we are adding some validators on the form controls of this address form group. Now if I go to the web page and inside this street address one, if I don't enter any value, so if I focus it and if I don't enter any value and if I click outside, you will see that a red border has been added for that form control. In the same way, this city is also a required field. So if I don't enter any value and if I click outside, this red border has been added. But if I enter a value, let's say London, in that case, that red border will be removed. Now, along with the red border, we also want to show some custom validation error message for the complete form group. Okay. For example, after this region and postal code, what I will do is I'll add a small element here and there I will say some of the address fields does not contain a valid value. And let me also use an asterisk before this. Okay, if I save the changes, if I go to the web page, so you see it says some of the address fields does not contain a valid value. Now, if I enter some valid value in these address fields, then also you will notice that this message is being displayed. But we don't want to display this message always. We only want to display this message if any one of the form control in this address form group has an invalid value, right? So for that, what we are going to do is, let me clear the console here. Let me submit the form. All right, so it is not submitting because we need to enter this first name, last name, and email also. Let's submit the form. So ng form object has been logged here. Let's go to this controls. There, let's expand this address form group. And in that form group, we have this valid property. Okay, we also have this invalid property. So what we want is, if this valid property for this form group is true, in that case, we don't want to display this error message, because in that case, all the form controls will have a valid value. So we don't want to show this error message in that case. Only if any one of the form controls in this form group has an invalid value, that time this valid property will be false for that form group. So that time only we want to show this error message. For that, what we are going to do is we are going to make use of this valid property, or we can also make use of this invalid property. So let's make use of this invalid property. So if this invalid property is true, then only we will show this error message. Otherwise, if this invalid property is false, we will not show this error message. For that, what we need is we need an instance of this form group in our view template. Right, in the view template, we need an instance of this form group. Then only we can access this valid or invalid property from this form group. Now, this form group, this address form group, it has been created using this ng model directive, right? So what we are going to do is here we are going to create a template reference variable. I'll simply call it as addr, and to this I am going to assign this ng model group. Now this ng model group, it is going to store an instance of this address form group, and from that instance we can access all these properties. So now what we are going to do is we are going to use this template reference variable. Let's scroll down, and here on this small element, let's use ngIf directive, and to this ngIf, let's assign that template reference variable, and on that template reference variable we are going to access this invalid property. So if the form is invalid, in that case this invalid will be true. In that case, this small element will be rendered in the web page. But if the form is valid, in that case this invalid property will be false. In that case, this small element will not get rendered in the web page. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. So currently it is rendered because this street address one, it is a required field, but we have not provided any value for that. This city is also a required field, so we need to provide a value for that. This country, it is already selected. Region is optional. Let's enter some value for the postal code. And now you will see that that error message is gone. So if all the form controls of that form group contains a valid value, then that error message is not being displayed. But if any one of the form control has an invalid value, for example, if I remove this value from here, in that case, this form control is invalid because it is a required field and we are not providing any value for it. So in that case, the complete form group will become invalid. And in that case, this error message will be displayed. Now, what I also want is, so initially when the page loads, that time also it is showing this error message. But what we want is, this error message should be shown if any one of the form control has an invalid value and if any one of the form control in that form group has been touched. After that only, we want to show this error message. Initially when the page loads, that time we don't want to show this error message. So here we are also going to add one more condition, and there let's say if addr dot touched. So this form group, this address form group, it also has a touched property. So if any one of the form control in that form group is touched, this touched property will be true. Okay, so if any control in the form group is touched and if any control in the form group has an invalid value, then only we want to show this small element in the web page. So now if I go to the web page, if the page loads, initially you will see that that error message is not being displayed. But if I click inside this street address and if I don't enter any value here, now you will see that that error message is being displayed now. But if we go ahead and if we enter valid value in each of these fields, okay, and let me also enter value for these required fields. And when I click on this submit button, you will see that ng form object has been logged. If I expand the form group, so for that, let's expand this controls. In that controls, we have this address form group. If I expand that, there you will see that the valid property is true, invalid property is false, this untouched property is false because each of the form control in this form group has been touched. and the touched property is true. And then we also have other properties. So if I check this dirty property, that is also true because the value of each of the form controls here has changed. Okay. So this is how we create a form group in a template driven form, and we can use it for validating a group of form controls together. Also, if I go to the value property of form, so here we have this ng form. If I go to the value property of that form, if I expand that, you will see that now the street address 1, street address 2, country, city, region, and postal code. These form controls are not coming as a property of this value object. Instead, in this value object, a new property called address has been added. So this address is the form group. So a new property called address has been added. And if I expand that address, this address is also an object. And in that object, we have a property for all those form controls. So now, for example, if you want to access this city property, then what you will have to do is, let's go to appcomponent.ts, and inside this on form submit, we are logging the value of first name, last name, email, and country. Let's say I also want to log the value of city property. And also we cannot access this country like this because now on this value object, we do not have this country property. If I go back, you will see that in this value object, we do not have country property. So for the country, you see it is logging undefined because now that country property is available inside this address field. So in order to access the country property on this value, first we will have to access the address property, and on that address property, we can access the country property. So if I save the changes, if I go back, let's enter some valid value in each of these form controls. And let's click on the submit button. So now you will see it is properly logging the country value. Now it is not undefined. In the same way, if you want to access the city property, let me copy this console.log statement. Then on this value object, first we will have to access the address property, and this address is an object, and inside that object we will have the city property. If I go back, let's again enter some valid value in these form controls. So now you can see the value entered in the city input field that has also been logged. So this is all from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day. In this lecture, you're going to learn how to update the value of a form control in a form. For that, we can use set value method or patch value method. So in this lecture, let's learn how to use set value method and patch value method and what is the difference between them. To understand set value and patch value, the first thing which I'm going to do is, in this form, I'm going to add one more form control called username. For that, let's go to VS Code, and here we are displaying this email field. In the same way, I also want to display a username field. So I'll copy this HTML, and after this date field, I'm going to paste that HTML. Okay, so input type is going to be text. Placeholder, let's call username. Then we also need to provide a name for this input element so that with that name, a form control will be created in the controls property of ng form. And also with that name, a property will be created in the value object. So here for the name, I'll call it as username. Okay, then here I'm going to use this ng model directive. So for now, let's remove this two-way data binding. This field, it is going to be a required field. Now, this field is going to store a username. It is not going to store any email. So I will remove this email validator from here. And on this field also, let's provide a template reference variable. Let's call it maybe uname. And to this, we are going to assign ng model. So since we are using ng model directive here, we know that using this ng model, Angular is going to create a form control for this input element in the ng form object. Okay, so this ng model here, it is going to store a reference to that form control. and we are assigning that reference to this uname template reference variable. Now here I don't want to use this span element, so I'll remove it from here. But I do want to show some validation error message if the username is not valid. So if the user has not provided any username in the username field, since it is a required field, we are going to show a validation error message to the user that this field is a required field. So here let's say username is a required field. All right. Now here, instead of using this email template reference variable, we are going to use this uname template reference variable. With this, if we save the changes, if we go to the web page, you'll also see a new field called username in the form. Now after this username, I also want to display a button element. So after this div or after this input element, let's go ahead and let's add a button element. And let's say the value is create a username. Okay, and on this button element, let's add a CSS class. So to design this button, I have already written some CSS. I'm going to use this CSS class on that button. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now there you will also see a button called create a username. So when this create a username button is clicked, what we want is we want to populate this username input field with a username which will be generated dynamically. So user will have two options. Either he can enter a username by his own, or he can also click on this create a username button and it will automatically generate a username for that user. Now we want to generate a username based on the user's first name, last name, and his date of birth. So if the user has not entered a value in this first name form control or in this last name form control, or if the user has not selected any value from this date of birth field, in that case, we want to disable this create a username button, because in order to create a username, user must supply a value for first name, last name, and date of birth. Based on that only, we are going to create a username. So if these fields does not have a valid value, we are going to disable this create a username button. Otherwise, if these three fields have a valid value, then only we will enable this create a username button. Now currently this create a username button is enabled. And that's why when I click on this button, you will notice that ng form object has been logged here. Now you might say on this button, we are not binding any click event and we are not calling any method. Right, so here on this button, we have not binded any click event. So when we are clicking on this button, how come it is logging this ng form object here? That's because by default, when we use a button inside a form, by default, that button will be of type submit. Okay, so whenever that button will be clicked, it will submit the form and it will also emit ng submit event. And we are listening for that ng submit event on this form. So here you can see we are listening for that ng submit event. And whenever the ng submit event will happen, we are calling this on form submitted method. And inside this method, we are logging that ng form object. That's why even though on this button we are not binding any click event, since when this button will be clicked, it will emit ng submit event. That's why this ng form object is being logged here. I hope it is clear. So what we are going to do is we are going to disable this button if the user has not supplied a valid value for first name, last name, and date of birth field. For that, let's go to VS Code. And the first thing which we are going to do is on this date of birth field, first of all, we are going to add a required attribute because we want to make this field a required field. And then on this, we are also going to add a template reference variable. Let's call it maybe temp dob. You can name this variable anything. And to this, let's assign ng model. Now, when we assign ng model to a template reference variable, we know that this ng model, it is going to have a reference of this input element in the form of JavaScript object. So for this input element, in the controls property of ng form, a form control object will be created with this dob name. And this ng model, it is going to store a reference to that form control object. And we are assigning that reference to that form control object to this temp dob. And we already have a template reference variable on the first name. So we are calling it fname and also on the last name. So we are going to make use of these template reference variables to disable this button element, this button here. So on this button element, we are going to add this disabled attribute, and on that we are going to do property binding. Now, when do we want to disable this button? We want to disable this button if the first name does not have a valid value, if the last name does not have a valid value, and if the date of birth does not have a valid value. So here let's say fname. So this fname is a template reference variable we are using on the first name input element, and it is going to store a reference of first name form control. On that form control, we are going to access invalid property. So if the first name has some invalid value, then we want to disable this button. Or if the last name has some invalid value, so on the last name input, we are using lname template reference variable. So if that last name form control also has some invalid value, for that we are going to use its invalid property, then also we want to disable this button. And finally, we also want to disable this button if the date of birth has some invalid value. So on this date of birth field, we are using this temp dob template reference variable. So we are going to make use of that. And this temp dob reference variable will have a reference to the form control for this date of birth input element. And we want to access its invalid property. So let's say dot invalid. Okay, so if first name input element has invalid value, or if last name element has invalid value, or this date of birth has some invalid value, in that case we want to disable the button. Otherwise, if all three of them has a valid value, then only we want to enable the button. Okay, so let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let me clear everything here. So currently we have not entered any valid value in first name, last name, or date of birth. So when I click on this create a username button, you will see nothing is happening. It is not logging the ngForm object. That's because currently this button is disabled. If I enter a first name and then if I click on this create a username, then also it is not logging ngForm object here, because again currently it is disabled, because for this last name and date of birth we do not have a valid value. So let's also enter a valid value for the last name. Again, if I click on this create a username button, again it is not logging ngForm object here, because this first name and last name has a valid value, but this date of birth does not have a valid value. But if I select a valid value for the date of birth field also, now when I click on this create a username button, now you see it has logged this ngForm object. So this button will be enabled only when the first name, last name, and this date of birth has a valid value. And once we have a valid value for the first name, last name, and date of birth, we want allow user to generate a username. For that, let's go back to VS Code, and on this button element, so let me move this attribute also in a different line so that it will be more readable. And here on this button, let's also listen to click event. And when this click event happens, we want to call a method maybe generate username. Okay, let's go ahead and let's create this method inside the app component class. So here, let's create that method. Now, in order to generate a username, we need the value in the first name. So for that, we have this first name property, which is going to store the value entered in the first name field. We also need the value from the last name. So this last name property is going to store the value entered in the last name field. In the same way, let's also create a property. Let's call it date of birth. Again, it is going to be of type string. Why string? Because in the web page, when the user will select a date of birth, that value will be a string value. Okay, that's why I'm creating it as a string value. And initially, let's set it to empty string. All right, and let's go ahead and let's do a two-way data binding of this date of birth property with the date of birth field. So here where we are using this ng model directive, there let's do two-way data binding. And to this ng model directive, let's assign that dob property. With this, let's save the changes. Now let's go to this app component.ts. And here, in order to calculate the username, let's first create a variable. Let's call it username. Initially, let's assign it with empty string. Then we will check if the first name, so we are going to make use of this first name property here. So if this first name, if it has a length greater than or equal to 3, then what we are going to do is we are going to get the first 3 characters from that first name. For that, let's say username plus equals, and here let's say this dot first name dot, and here I'm going to use the slice method. Okay, and to this slice method we will pass the starting index. So I want to get the first 3 characters, so the starting index will be 0, and since we want to get 3 characters, the second parameter will be 3. So let's say if the name is John, from that John we want to get the first 3 characters, that is JON. Okay, so here this line, it will return the first 3 characters from the first name, and we are assigning it to the username. But if the first name length is less than 3, that means if it is 2 or 1, in that case let's also write an else statement, and there let's say username plus equals this dot first name. Okay, let's do the same thing for last name. So if the user has provided last name, from that last name also we want to get the first 3 characters if the length of the last name is greater than or equal to 3. Otherwise, if the length of last name is less than 3, in that case we want to append that last name to this username. So here also it should be last name. Okay, but if the first name does not have a length greater than or equal to 3, in that case it will get the complete first name. And if the last name does not have a length greater than or equal to 3, it will get the complete last name and it will append it to this username. So here we are getting the first 3 characters from the first name and first 3 characters from the last name. Finally, we also want to get the year from the date of birth field, and we want to append that year to the username. So for that, let's create a variable. Let's call it birth year. Okay, and here we are going to create a new instance of date object, and to the constructor of this date object, we are going to pass the date of birth which we are going to receive for this date of birth property. So whatever date of birth user will select in the UI, that will be assigned to this date of birth property, this DOB property, and it will be a string value. And we are going to pass that string value to this date object. And based on that string value, this date object will return us a date type. Okay, so it is going to return us a date time. So instead of calling it birth here, let me call it date time. And from this date time, I want to get the year. For that, I can say datetime dot get full year. So this will return us the year part from the datetime. And we are going to append that year to the username. So here let's say username plus equals, and we are going to append the year from that date of birth. And finally, let's convert this username to lowercase. So for that, let's say username dot to lowercase. And let's go ahead and let's log this username in the console. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let me clear everything here. So initially this button will be disabled, but if we enter a valid name for the first name, last name, and date of birth, and when I click on this create a username, you will see that it has created a username here and it has been logged here. But here it has not converted it all to lowercase. That's because after converting this username to lowercase, we also need to assign it back to this username. Let's save the changes now. Let's go back to the web page. Let me select the first name, last name, and a date of birth. And when I click on this create a username, now you will see that a username has been created and it is all in lowercase. Now we want to populate this username field with the generated username. Let's see how we can do that. Let's go back to VS Code and let's first try to access the value property of ngForm object, and using that value property, let's try to update the username. So we are storing ngForm object in this form property. So let's first access that form property. For that, here let's say this dot form, and this form is going to return us an instance of ng form. That ng form will have a value property, and in that value property, a property called username will be created, because here we are creating an input element where the name is username. So with this name, a property will be created in the value object, and we want to access that username property, and here we want to set its value to this username which we are calculating here. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page and let's see if it works. So let's say first name is Manoj, last name is Jha, and let's select a date of birth. Let's click on this create a username button. You see, the username has been calculated. We can see it here, but it has not populated that username field with that username value. But here, after assigning this username property with the username value, if I go ahead and if I log it, so let me log this expression here. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Let's select first name. Let's select last name. Let's select a date of birth. And let's click on this create a username button. So you see at line number 62, it is logging that username. So that means we are logging that username at this line. So that means this username has been assigned with the value which we are trying to assign it here. But for some reason, it is not updating this input field here. Now, why is that? That's because here we are trying to update a property of this value object. Okay, so we are trying to update this username property of this value object. So it will update it here. As you can see, it has updated it here. But it is not going to populate that value in this form control, because this username here, it is a property of this value object. It is not a form control. Okay. Now let's try it in another way. So here, instead of using the value property, let's try to access the form control of the username, and then let's try to update its value. For that, we can use this controls property. And when we are using the controls property, we cannot use the dot notation. There we will have to use square bracket notation. And this username, it should be a string value in that case. And on that, let's try to access value property and let's try to update its value. Okay, now here you will notice that we have an error. And when I hover over this error, it says cannot assign to value because it is a read-only property. Okay, so the value here, it is read-only property. We cannot assign it a value directly. So how can we update a value in a form control? For that, we can use set value method or patch value method. Okay, so let me remove these two lines of code, or I'll comment it for your reference. And now let's talk about set value method. So the set value method is used to update a form control, form group, or form array. And when we use set value method, we pass an object to the set value method to update the value of a form control, form group, or form array. And the structure of the object that we are passing to this set value method, that must match the structure of the form control, form group, or form array which we are trying to update. Let's try to understand this with an example. So here, let's try to access this dot form, and this form property here, it is storing an instance of this ng form. On that, let's call set value. So here, using the set value method, we are trying to update a form. Now, when we are trying to update a form here, to this set value, we need to pass an object, and the structure of that object must match. So let me enter first name, last name, and date of birth here. So here we have an error. This error is because this set value method, it is expecting an object with some properties. Now, for now, let me comment this line here. Okay, and let's go back again. And again, let me enter first name, last name, and a date of birth. And when I click on this create username, this ng form object has been logged. Here we have this value object. So the object which we are going to pass to the set value method, the structure of that object must match the structure of this object which is assigned to this value property. So there we need to have all these properties. We also need to have this address property, and this address property should be an object, and in that object we should have these properties. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's provide this structure to this set value. So let me uncomment it, and in this object we want to have a first name property, and this first name property, let's assign it with empty string for now. In the same way, let's also have a last name property to this also. Let's assign empty string for now. Let's remove this keyword. Then we also have an email property there, and to this email property also let's assign empty string. Then there we also have this phone property. Let's assign it with empty string. We have DOB property. Again, let's assign it with empty string. Then we also have address property, which is again going to be an object because this address property is a form group. And in that address property, we have street1. So a property called street1. For now, let's assign it with the value empty string. We have a property called street2. There also, let's assign it with the value empty string. Then let's go back to the web page. So we also have a country and city property. Initially, let's assign it with empty string. We have city property, that also let's assign it with empty string. Then we have a region property. Again, let's set it to empty string. And we have postal property, and let's assign it to empty string. Okay, and here first name, email, phone, DOB, and we also have username property now because we have created a new field called username. And this username property we want to update with this username value which we are calculating. So let's assign that username here. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now let me enter a first name, last name, and let's enter some email. And I'll simply enter a date of birth. And now let's click on this create a username. So here we have a error. It says must supply a value for form with the name last name. Okay, this n should be in lowercase. Okay, let's go back again. Let's see if we have any other errors. And let me select a date of birth. Now it says must supply a value for form control with name gender. We have not supplied a gender property here. So let's also add that gender property. And let's say it should be male. Okay, I'm simply assigning some default values here. Later we will see how we can get the value from the form control and keep that value itself. Let's go back. Let's again select first name, last name, a date of birth, and let's click on this create a username. So you see, now this username field has been populated with the calculated username. But after that, this first name, last name has become empty, and other fields are also empty, and the gender selected is male. That's because when we are updating the value of the form controls, there for the first name, last name, and other fields, we are passing empty string. So even though the username has been calculated and that username control has been populated with the proper username, other fields have become empty. Now, how to solve this problem? To solve this problem, again, we are going to make use of this form property. So this form is of type ng form. So here, what we are going to do is we are going to say this dot form dot value dot, and from that value object we want to read the value of first name. So here let's say first name. Okay, let's do the same thing for other fields as well. Here we want to read the value of last name. Here we want to read the value of email. Here we want to read the value of phone property. Here we want to read the value of date of birth property. And here we want to read the value of gender property. Okay, we want to update the username with the username which we have calculated here. Rest other things, we want to keep the value which the user has entered previously. So here we want to read the value of street1 property and we want to assign it to this street1 property of this object. Here we want to read the value of street2. Here we want to read the value of country property. Then here we want to read the value of city property. Here we want to read the value of region property. And here we want to read the value of postal property. Let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page and let's try it one more time. So let's provide first name, let's provide last name, let's provide email. Okay, and let's select our date of birth. And let's click on this create a username button. So now you see, now these values are not getting removed and the username is also generated. Okay, so based on the first name, last name and date of birth, a username has been generated. Now here we have this error and it says must supply a value for form control with name street1. That's because here this street1, it is not present on this value property. Instead, in this value property, we will have an address property, and in that address property, we will have this street1 property. So this address property, it is going to be an object, and in that object, we will have this street1 property because this address is a form group. So let's do the same thing for other properties here because all these properties are available inside the address object. It is not available inside the value object. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page and let's see if we still get that error. So I'll set the first name, last name, and let's select a date of birth. And now when I click on this create a username, we don't have that error anymore. All right. So when we are using this set value method, to that set value method, we need to pass an object, and that object structure must match the structure of this value object. Okay. So you see here we only want to update one field, this username field. But to update this username field, we need to provide the complete object, right? So here, instead of using set value method, what we can also do is we can use patch value method. So let me comment this line here. And now let's use patch value method. So again, on this form property, so this form property is going to return us an instance of ng form. On that, we are going to have another property called form. And in this form, we have a method called patch value. To this patch value also, we need to pass an object. But in this object, we only need to specify that field which we want to update. Here, we only want to update the username field. And to this username field, we want to assign the value which we have calculated for this username variable. So if I save the changes, if I go to the web page, let's select first name, let's select last name, let's select a date of birth, and let's click on this create a username button. And you will notice that that username field has been populated with the automatically generated username. So using patch value is as simple as that. Now, let's say if you want to update a property from a form group. So if I expand this value field here, let's say if you want to update this country field, in that case, you need to access it something like this. So first, you need to specify the form group name, which is address in this case, and you need to specify an object because in the value object, we have a property called address, and in that address object only, we have a property called country, right? And let's say we want to assign this country with the value, maybe Japan. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And let me select first name, let me select last name, let's select a date of birth. Currently, the country selected is India, but when I click on this create a username, you will notice that the country selected is now Japan. So when you want to access a property from a form group, you need to use it something like this. So as I mentioned, in the value object, we have this address property, and in that address property only, we have this country property. So if we want to update the country property using patch value method, we need to access it like this. So first we need to create this address property, which is an object. In that address property, we have this country property, and we can set its value. So this is how we can use patch value method. When we use set value method, there when we pass an object, that object structure must match the structure of the value object. But when we use patch value method, there we only need to specify the structure of the property which we want to update. I hope it is clear. So the patch value method is used to update only a subset of the element of form group or form array, and it will only update the matching objects and ignore the rest other properties. In this lecture, we are going to learn how we can reset a template driven form. Now, before we learn how we can reset a form, let me show you one bug here. And the bug is, let's say I select the first name, I select the last name, and I select the date of birth here. Now, when I will click on this create a username button, based on the first name, last name, and date of birth, it is going to generate a username. But this button here, we have not specified a type for this button. So by default, since we are using this button inside a form, by default, its type will be submit. That means when this button will be clicked, this form will be submitted. So when I click on this create a username button, you will notice that a username has been generated based on first name, last name, and date of birth, and the form has been submitted. And when the form has been submitted, it has logged this ng form object. Now, here we don't want to submit the form when this create a username button is clicked. We only want to submit the form when this submit button is clicked. To solve this problem, all we have to do is we have to set the type for this button as button. By default, since we have not specified a type for this create a username button, so if I scroll down here, we have that create a username button. For this button, we are not specifying any type. So by default, it will be of type submit because we have defined this button inside a form. So by default, its type will be submit. But we can also set its type to button. So here, let's set the type to button. And now the type of this create a username button is button. So now it is not going to submit the form. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to our web page. And now if I select first name, last name, and the date of birth, and now when I click on this create a username button, for some reason it is still submitting the form. That's because here I have misspelled the type. Okay, let's save the changes now. Let's go back to the web page. Let's select first name, last name, and date of birth, and let's click on this create a username button. So it has calculated the username and it has populated this username field with that username, but now it is not submitting the form, because if it would have submitted the form, we would be seeing the ng form object here. So now when this button is being clicked, it is not submitting the form. So this is one issue which I wanted to resolve here. Another problem is when this create a username button is clicked, it is calculating the username and it is populating this username control with that username. And with that, it is also setting the country to Japan. So let me reload the page. You see, initially, the default value for the selected country is India. Now, if I enter first name, if I enter last name, and if I select a date of birth, when I click on this create a username button, a username will be generated and this username control will be populated with that username. And it will also change the country to Japan. Just notice what happens here. So when I click on this create a username button, a username has been calculated and the country has changed to Japan. This is because when this create a username button is clicked, we are calling this generate username method. And let's go to app component.ts. And if I scroll down, here we have this generate username method. In that method, after we have set the username by using this patch value method, so we are using this patch value method to populate the username control. right? So after we have set the username, for that username control, we are also setting a new value for the country control, and we are setting it to Japan. So here I'll simply comment this line because we don't want to change the country to Japan once the username button is clicked. So I'll simply comment it, I'll save it. And now if we go to the web page, if I select first name, if I select last name, and if I select a date of birth, it should calculate a username based on the first name, last name, and date of birth. So as you can see, it has calculated the username and populated this username control with that username, but now it is not changing the country to Japan. All right, with that, now let's see how we can reset a form. So currently, if I enter some data in these fields, and when I click on this submit button, you will notice that the form has been submitted and this ng form object has been logged here. But all the form controls in this form still have the previous value. So what we want is, once the user has entered all the details in the form controls and when he has clicked on this submit button, the form should be submitted and the form should also be reset. That means all its controls should become empty and the state of the form should also reset. Let's see how we can do that. Doing that is very simple. All we have to do is, once the form is submitted, we are calling this on form submitted method. So once the form is submitted, we are reading the value of some of the form controls. After that, we want to reset the form. And to reset the form, all we have to do is on the ng form object. For that, we can use this dot form property. So this form property is storing an instance of ng form object. On that object, we have a method called reset. Once we call this reset method, it will simply reset the form. That means all the form controls of that form will be reset to empty and the state of the form will also get reset. Let's see that. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page and let's enter some details in these form controls. And now when I click on this submit button, the form has been submitted and all its form controls have also been reset. And also the state of the form control will be reset. Let me actually show you that. So let's go to this elements tab. There, let me expand this app root. There we have this form. In that form, we have this div. There we have this input element called first name, and we also have input element called last name. Okay, so currently, let's take an example of this first name input control. So currently, you will notice that on this first name, this ng untouched, ng pristine, and ng invalid CSS classes have been added, right? Because this form has been reset. Now, let me go and let me enter some details here. Okay, let's select all the required fields. And now when I click on the submit button, just notice what happens. When I click on this submit button, the form has been reset and you will notice that again, this ng untouched, ng pristine and ng invalid CSS classes have been added on these form controls. So here, when the form is getting submitted, the state of the form control is also changing. And this is what I mean when I say that when the form will be reset, it will change the state of the form control as well as the form. So when we enter something in the first name control, so for example, when I touch this form control, this ng untouched will be removed and ng touched will be added. See, ng untouched has been removed, ng touched has been added. Okay, if I enter some value in this first name field, then ng pristine will be removed and ng dirty will be added. As you can see, ng pristine has been removed and ng dirty has been added. And this form control now also contains a valid value. So this ng valid CSS class has also been added and ng invalid has been removed. Now once this form will be submitted, this form control will be reset. That means on this form control, this ng untouched CSS class, ng pristine CSS class and ng invalid CSS class will be added. For example, let me select the value for the required fields. And just notice what happens to these CSS classes on this first name control when I submit the form. So now when I submit the form, you see ng touched was removed and ng untouched has been added, ng dirty was removed and ng pristine has been added, and ng valid was removed and ng invalid has been added. So the state of this form control has been reset. In the same way, the state of all these form controls will be reset. You can see that now for the gender, no value has been selected. And for the country also, no value is selected. But if you remember, in one of the lectures, we set this male as the default value for gender and we set India as the default value for country. But once the form has been reset, every control has become empty and the state of each of the form controls has been reset. Now, what we also want is once the form is submitted, the form should reset, but the gender should have a default value male and the country should have a default value India. So let's go ahead and let's do that. So after we have reset the form, what we are also going to do is we are going to set the value for gender and country. And to set the value, we have learned that we can use set value or patch value method. Now here I'm going to use patch value method. So again on the ng form object, we have that ng form object inside this form property. On that, we have another property called form. And in that form, we have a method called patch value. To this patch value, we need to pass an object. And this object, it should have properties similar to value object of ng form. And here we don't need to specify all the properties. We only need to specify those properties whose value we want to set. So here we want to set the value for gender property. So in the value object, we will have a gender property and we want to set its value. We want to set its value to male. And then in the value object, we also have a country property. Now that country property is not present directly inside the value object. Instead, in the value object, we have an address property and that address property is an object. And in that object, we have a country property. And we want to set the value of this country property to India. Okay, so once the form has been reset, we also want to set the default value for gender and address. With this, if I save the changes, if we go back to the web page and let's go ahead and let's enter some data in the required fields. Let's create a username. Let's select street address. Let's select city. Let's select postal code. And now when I click on the submit button, you will notice that all the controls have been reset. And for the gender, this default value male is selected. And for the country, the default value India is selected. So this is how you can set some default value for some of the controls after the form has been reset. This is all from this lecture. Thank you for listening and have a great day. In this lecture, let's learn how we can retrieve the data which the user has entered into the form controls and how to display that data in the web page. Now, we already know that we can retrieve the form data of each of the form controls from the value property of ng form object. So here, this ng form object has been logged when this form has been submitted. And when I expand this ng form object, if I scroll down, there we have this value property. And in that value property, we have a property with each of these form control names. For example, for the first name, the form control name is first name. With that, we have a property here. In the same way, for the last name, we have a form control. We have an input element in the HTML with the name last name. And with that name, a property has been created inside this value property. Then for the username also, we have a control called username. And with that name, a property has been created here. So here we have this username property. Similarly, we have a property for gender. So for these radio buttons, we have provided a name called gender. And with that name, a property has been created here. In the same way, we have also created a form group called address. So with that form group name, a property has been created inside this value property. And in that form group, we have these controls. So we have this street 1 control, street 2 control, this city control, country control, region and postal code control. So a property for each of these controls will be created inside this address form group inside this address object, as you can see. So in order to read the value of a form control from a template driven form, we can make use of this value property. And we are already doing that. So if I go to VS Code and if I go to app component.ts, before we are submitting the form, we are reading the value of this first name property from the controls property of the ng form object. And then in order to read last name, email, country and city, we are making use of this value property of ng form object. Now currently we are simply logging it in the developer console. But instead of logging it in the developer console, what we want is we want to show these data in the web page. So we can do it in several ways. One of the ways is that you can create some properties, like we are already creating this first name, last name, email address and date of birth property. In the same way, we can also create other properties like gender, country, city, then let's say region, and let's also create a postal property. And now, instead of logging these values in the console, what we want is we want to assign these values to these properties. So here I'll simply go ahead and I will comment this console.log statement, or what I will do is I will simply remove it from here. Now what we want is we want to set this first name property with the first name property of value object. So here let's say this dot first name equals this dot form dot value dot first name. So in the value object, we have this first name property, which will store the value which the user has entered inside the first name input element. In the same way, let's also do it for last name, email, gender, city, country, and other properties. And here the property name is email address. Then let's set the value for country property. And in the value object, we have a property called address. And in that address, we have a property called country. Then let's do the same thing for city. And here in the address property, we have a city property. Then in the address, we also have a region property. And I want to assign the value stored in this region property to the region property of this app component class. And finally, we also have a postal property inside this address property of value object. And I want to assign the value stored in this postal property to the postal property of app component. So in this app component, we have created this postal property. To this, we are assigning the value which the user has entered in the postal input element. With this, let's save the changes. Now, we are storing the values which the user has entered in these properties. Now what we want is, we want to display the data stored in these properties in the web page. For that, what I'll do is, in the app component.html, I'm going to write some HTML. So after this form, I'll write some HTML to display the data which the user has entered in the form elements. And in order to save some time, I've already written some HTML. So I'll copy it from here and I'll paste it here. Okay, so here we want to display the user full name, his email address, his username, date of birth, and we also want to display the address like country, city, region, and postal code. Okay, so using this HTML, we will display the details of the user. Now, in order to design this HTML, I have also written some CSS. So let's grab that CSS from here and let's paste it inside the app component.css. All right, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now you will notice that after this form, we also have one more section where we are displaying the details of the user. Now, currently these details are hard-coded. So now instead of displaying the hard-coded data, we want to display the data which the user has entered in the form. For that, let's go back to VS Code. Let's go to appcomponent.html. And here we want to display the user's full name. So we want to display the user first name and last name. So for that, I'll use string interpolation syntax here. And here I'll use first name property. So in the app component, we have a first name property, and that is going to store the data which the user has entered inside the first name input element. In the same way, we also have a last name property. So after the first name, we also want to display the value stored in the last name property. And this last name property, it is going to store the data which the user has entered inside the last name input element. Similarly, here we want to display the data which the user has entered inside the email field. For that, we are storing that data in the email address property. Then here we want to display the username. Now for the username, we have not created any property. So let's quickly go ahead and let's create a property for username. So here, let's create a property called username. Okay, it is going to be of type string, and initially let's set it with empty string, and let's make this n caps. So we also want to set this username property with the username which the user has entered in the username input element. So let's say this dot username equals, let me copy this line. So this username is not grouped in the address form group. It is present inside the value object itself. So on the value object, we will have a property called username. So we are now reading that username value and we are assigning to this username property. So let me close this CSS file here. So here we are going to use that username property. Okay, then here we want to display the date of birth. Again, I'll use string interpolation syntax. And for the date of birth, we are creating a property called DOB. But we have not assigned that property with the value which the user has selected in the date of birth field. So here again, let's say this dot DOB equals, and again in the value object, so you can say this dot form dot value, and in that value object we will have a DOB property. So whatever date of birth user has selected, we want to assign it to this DOB property of app component class. Okay, so here we want to display the value stored in DOB property of app component class. Then here we want to display the value stored in the country property. So here I will use that country property of app component. Here I'll use the city property of app component. Here I will use the region property of app component. And here I'll use the postal code property. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let's see if we have any error. Okay, so far we don't have any error. And if I scroll down, currently you will see nothing is being displayed here. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's enter a first name. Let's enter last name. And now if I scroll down, you will see that the first name and last name has been populated here. It is being displayed here. Now, we have not submitted the form, but still this first name and last name is being displayed here. That's because if I go back and if we scroll up, for this first name and last name, we are using two-way data binding. So here we have the first name property, and on that, if you notice, we are using two-way data binding. But now what I will do is I will simply remove this two-way data binding because we want to retrieve the value of first name input element only when the submit button is clicked. So I'll remove it from here. Then here also we are using this two-way data binding on this last name. So let me remove it from here as well. Okay. Then on this email also we are using two-way data binding. I'll remove it from here. Then let me see if we are using two-way data binding anywhere else. So on the date of birth also we are using two-way data binding. So let's remove it from here. All right. And then we are not using two-way data binding anywhere else. All right. So now if I go to the web page, here we have one error and it says no directive found with export ng model. All right, so from the first name, since we have removed the ng model directive, now it is not taking it as a form control for this form. So we wanted to remove only two-way data binding, but we wanted to use the ng model. But since we have removed it, this ng model does not contain any value now. So here, let's also use ng model, because once we use ng model, then only this input element will become a form control for this form which we are defining here. Let me do the same thing for last name as well. So I think from the last name input element also, I have removed that ng model. So let's use it here. Then let's use it on the email as well. Let me scroll down. On the date of birth also, we need to use the ng model. And in other places, we already have this ng model. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now there is no error. So now when I enter first name, when I enter last name, now if I scroll down, you see now it is not showing it. Now it will only show it once the submit button is clicked. Let's enter some email. Let's select date of birth. Let's specify a username. Let's select street address 1. Let's select city. So New Delhi. Country is already selected as India. Region NCR. Postal code may be 234567. All right, now when I click on this submit button, this form will reset. So as you can see, the form has reset, but the details are being displayed here. Okay, so in this way, we can read the value of each of the form controls using this value property of ngForm object. And then we can store that value in some properties and then we can display it accordingly. Now here in the avatar, I want to display the initials of first name and last name. For that, what I will do is, let's go back and let's go to that section where we are displaying the details. So here, currently it is hard coded. Now what I want is, here I want to display the first letter from the first name. So for that I can say first name dot, and on that I'm going to use splice method, and I want to extract the first letter from the first name. For that, the first letter will be present as the index 0. So I'll pass the starting index as 0, and we want to extract only one character from the first name. So here I'll say 1. Then I'll also convert it to uppercase. In the same way, let me copy this expression from here, and we also want to extract the first letter from the last name. So here, instead of using first name property, I'll use last name property. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page, and here we have an error and it says splice does not exist on type string. All right, here I wanted to use slice method actually. Okay, and here also it should be slice. Let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page. So the error is gone. Let's select the first name. Let's select the last name. Let's select email. Let's select a date of birth. Let's select a username. Let's select street address, city, postal code, and let's select the country as Japan. Let's click on the submit button. Form has been reset and the details are being displayed here. Okay, so now you can see here in this avatar, the initials from this first name has been taken. All right. So here what we are doing is, in order to read the data which the user has inputted inside the form controls, first we are creating some properties and then we are assigning those properties with the value, with some value, by reading the properties of this value object of ng form. So this is all from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day. In this lecture, let's learn how we can work with checkboxes in a template-driven form. And to understand that, in this form, what I have done is I have added a checkbox. Okay, and we are going to work with this checkbox in order to understand how we can work with checkboxes. So what I want is, when this checkbox is clicked, in that case, I want to set the value for this checkbox as true. But if it is not checked, in that case, I want to set its value as false. For that, let's go to VS Code. And there, this is the HTML which is displaying that checkbox. Here we are specifying an input element of type checkbox, and there we have also provided a name. So with this name, a control will be created in the ng form object. Now in order to make this input element a form control of the ng form object, here we also need to use ng model directive. Okay, and that's it. If I save the changes now, and if we go to the web page, and here let me go ahead and let me enter some value in the required fields. And here I have not checked the checkbox. Now when I click on this submit button and if I expand this ng form object, first of all you will notice that the form has been reset. Okay, all the controls have become empty. And because of that, if I expand this value object, you will not see any value for any of these properties. So everything is set to null. Now to avoid this, what we are going to do is we are going to comment this line where we are resetting the form. And now let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page and let's submit the form again. And again, I'm not checking this checkbox. Let me click on the submit button. Let's expand this ng form now. And now we should have all the values from the form controls, as you can see. And there we have this agreement checkbox. And it is set to empty string. Okay, now if I clear the console here and if I go ahead and if I check the checkbox and if I click on the submit button, in that case, that agreement should be true. So you see the agreement is true. And if I uncheck this checkbox and then if I submit the form, now the agreement should be false. So now you see agreement is false. But initially for the first time, the agreement will be empty string. Now, initially when the page loads, this form loads, that time I want to set this checkbox to false. For that, we are going to do property binding. So in the app component.ts file, let's create one more property. Okay, and here let's call this property is agreed. It is going to be of type boolean and initially let's set it with the value false. And now we are going to property binding on this property. So here I'm going to bind this ng model with that property. Let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page. Let's again enter the details in the required fields. And now if I don't select this checkbox and if I click on the submit button, let's expand this ng form. Now you will notice that this agreement is false. But if I select this checkbox and click on the submit button, it should be true. So it is true. And when the form will be submitted, that time also what we want is we want to set this is agreed property and we want to read the value from the values object and we want to set it. So here we can say this dot is agreed equals this dot form dot value, and in this value object we have the agreement property. So this is how we can work with checkboxes in template driven form. So in this section, we learned about template-driven forms in great detail. We learned each and every concept of template-driven form, how to use them, how to create them, how to retrieve the value from a template-driven form, and many more things. Now, just to recap, a template-driven form is called as a template-driven form because in a template-driven form, we do everything in the components view template. Now, we can also create a form programmatically by writing some code. And that approach is called as reactive form approach. And we are going to learn about reactive forms in great detail in our next section. This is all from this section and from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.